He could buy anything the world put a price on. He could buy silence in a room full of men, buy loyalty with bank transfers, buy monuments of marble and glass, but he could not buy his son's voice. On a rain-slicked night 2 years earlier, the mansion had been all cold marble and thunder. The chauffeur's tires whispered on the long drive as Maxwell Thornton stood at the French doors, palms flat against the glass, watching the yard blur into streaks of silver. Inside, the house hummed with its own quiet wealth. Scented candles, the ticking of an expensive clock, the soft mechanical breathing of machines in rooms he'd paid to build. Money had made the place safe from most threats. It had not made it safe for the person he loved most. Melissa's death did not arrive. Cinematic, there were no slow-motion last words, no elegiac music. It happened in a doorway when a guest should have been leaving and the house should have been closing its eyes. The details that mattered afterwards were sparse and brutal. A sound that Maxwell would name 1,000 different ways, metal on bone. A break in the pattern of life fond, then a child who stopped speaking altogether. Ethan's voice fell silent the moment his mother didn't stand up again. There was no scream to be heard later. Only a pocket of total quiet, where a boy's small words used to be. For 2 years, Maxwell moved through every solution money could manufacture. He summoned specialists with foreign accents and private letters of recommendation. He converted rooms into clinical spaces and filled them with glass and cool light. He bought machines that promised to read the dark places of the mind. He spent $3 million in consults, therapies, and technology as advanced neurofeedback, therapists trained in trauma care, play therapists flown from abroad, and for 2 years, the house only accumulated receipts and failed promises. Dozens of professionals, his assistant would say in the kind of voice people used when repeating a list meant to convince themselves as much as him. All offering, but whatever they offered came back with the same hollow echo. Zero progress. The experts called different things by clinical names. Maxwell called it nothing he could understand, something that sat in Ethan like a lodged stone, a silence so deliberate it felt like punishment. Doctors spoke about trauma, about protective withdrawal. Maxwell, who had solved problems by removing threats, could not make this one go away. So he controlled the tangibles, the safe rooms, the guards, the schedule, the staff. He could not, however, control the way the boy folded into himself when anyone raised a hand too quickly, or the way Ethan flinched at voices that rose like storms. The mansion became both fortress and mausoleum. The boy sat on the periphery of his empire, small and untouched by its riches, watched and untouched as if silence were a disease that could be quarantined. Maxwell's fury and grief braided into something colder, a determination that, if medicine failed, he would reconstitute love into something measurable. But no combination of wealth and force had yet nudged the smallest syllable from the child's mouth. Across town, in a flat whose windows rattled when the trucks rolled by, Charlotte Hayes was learning to value the little things money could not buy either. Her life was a series of small reckonings. She bathed her mother, Dorothy, in the evenings by candlelight when the electricity bills threatened to bite. She counted pills into cups every morning and learned the names of hospital corridors the way other people learned songs. The South Side smelled of fryer grease and wet cardboard after rain. It tasted of hard work and prayer, sometimes the same thing. Charlotte's hands bore the history of that life coalesced at the base of the palm, a faint scar on the thumb from a childhood that had insisted in being survived rather than lived. When she took the job at the Thornton mansion, it was because a nurse at the clinic had given her a flyer, and because Dorothy's care needed funds like rain needs clouds. She arrived for the interview in a thrifted blazer her sister had mended, carrying an application folder and a small plastic bag with sandwiches for the bus ride home. The driveway widened into a world she had only seen behind the glass of taxis. Hedges trimmed into quiet rectangles, a fountain that whispered in a language of coins. The staff entrance smelled of lemon cleaner and old leather. A house manager, named Victoria Sterling, who had lived and been polished in high places for longer than Charlotte had been alive, met her clipboard first and gave her the kind of look meant to measure up and find fault. "Housekeeping at the Thorntons is discreet," Victoria said, the syllables clipped and precise. "We don't do loud. We don't do unscheduled. You understand?" Charlotte nodded because a job was a job and because Dorothy needed a job like a shadow needs light. Someone handed her a pair of yellow rubber gloves before she stepped beyond the threshold, a small, absurd thing against the monumentality of chandeliers in marble. They were thick and slightly coarse, the kind used for heavy scouring, but their color struck her like an exclamation sunflower against ivory. She slipped them on and discovered, almost immediately, how differently they felt. The sound of latex against porcelain as she scrubbed the sink, the way the color caught on the pale sheets when she straightened a bed. In that house of the immeasurable, the gloves became a small talisman, stubborn and uncomplicated in their cheerfulness. Charlotte tucked them into the back pocket of her jeans when she was off duty, like a soldier carrying a trinket into battle. She was good at her work. Cleaning was an act of respect in Charlotte's hands. She believed in the dignity of setting things right. She noticed the small emergencies that no one else seemed to see. A stain on a napkin left from a hurried dinner, the way a toy's wheel twisted loose from an otherwise impeccable playroom. She hummed while she worked, half to keep her thoughts from wandering, and half because the old song stitched something together inside her. When she hummed, it was not performance, it was presence. It was the sound a person makes when they speak to the space around them because they refuse to let silence claim it first. Ethan first noticed Charlotte the way a small animal notices warmth. Slow, careful, with a measuring of distance. Charlotte did not move like the therapists who arrived with tablets and plans. She did not speak in clinical tones or promise to fix what was broken. She moved through the house with practical attentiveness. She folded Ethan's tiny pajamas with the same attention she might a napkin. She left small, unremarked things in his retro paper boat on the window ledge. A small plastic stethoscope left from a child's party, things that invited touch more than demand words. The earliest change was not dramatic. It was the tiny curvature of a shoulder as Ethan shuffled across the rug toward the sound of her humming. Charlotte had been polishing the brass rail when she began a lullaby her mother had taught her. A threadbare tune that made the apartment on the south side hold its breath. The sound floated up the staircase, unremarkable and honest. Without looking, she kept the rhythm with her scrubber. Ethan came and sat not on the bed but by the foot, hands folded, eyes like two questions. He did not speak. He listened. Weeks of small things became the slow geometry of trust. She read to him by the soft light of the nursery lamp and let him pull the ends of the pages with fingers that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. She played doctor because he had once put a plastic stethoscope to a stuffed bear and then had not ever again. When she placed the stethoscope on his chest, it was ritual, no medical promise attached. Just the soft press of plastic. He accepted it the first time. Then again, Ethan began to play with her, instead of merely tolerating her presence. He mimicked the way she folded the sheets. He arranged his toy cars along the windowsill. He made a small track and drove them slowly, as if rehearsing rhythm. The morning he spoke, the house was basking. Maxwell, who had come downstairs to the study, happened to be passing the nursery window. He had not intended to watch. He had been thinking of other things, of ledgers and funerals, and whether a new security protocol might make any difference to a thing that was not of this world. He was a man who had learned to hide what he felt behind contracts and architecture. What woke in him that day was not a plan but an animal, a rawness that broke the neatness of his strategies. Charlotte was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, a storybook open on her lap. Ethan sat on his heels opposite, his small face centered in a cone of light. He was trying to line up the illustrations with the words, vowing small conquests over picture after picture. Charlotte's voice kept a soft cadence, the kind of pattern that makes the mind settle. At one point she hummed the refrain, not because she expected anything, but because songs were how she anchored herself. He said, unexpectedly, and so low it might have been swallowed by the shutters, all better. The sound was a pebble thrown into a still pond. Maxwell stumbled away from the window like someone who had walked into a room and found themselves someone else. The word held no fanfare, no grande annunciation. It had the weight of a private, sacred transaction. Ethan's face, as if puzzled at his own risk, lifted to Charlotte. He tried the phrase again, a little louder, as if testing the texture of language. All better, he whispered. There are moments when someone's entire architecture rearranges itself around a single, small event. That afternoon rearranged a man who had been carved by loss and force. Maxwell felt something fold open inside him that had been sealed by grief and guarded by money. He realized very simply and without the usual machinery of negotiation that the voice came from a place money had not reached. The child's syllable was not bought, it was invited. He felt it like light through a boarded window. He called her into his study that evening and did something that made the staff exchange quick, curious looks. He gave Charlotte a check with numbers that would have embarrassed people more used to counting beans than millions. He told her to book whatever surgery Dorothy needed, to let money for medical care stand where it always had not quite stood before. Awkward, practical, absolute. And then he asked her to stay. Charlotte accepted the help for Dorothy with the awkward gratitude of someone who took care of her mother by letting her shoulders stay bent and her dignity intact. She accepted the job at the mansion because to leave would be to leave what she had built. What she had given Ethan was now, in a strange twist, opening something in Maxwell that wanted to see that work continue. For Maxwell, offering money was easier than offering trust. He wrapped both in the same envelope and handed them to Charlotte with the trembling steadiness of a man doing something both new and necessary. The house watched, and the staff watched the house. People who had been around for decades noted, in ways that made them feel proprietary, that Charlotte hummed as she worked. She kept the yellow gloves in the back of her apron now, a private ribbon of color in a world otherwise rendered in neutrals. To Maxwell's veterans, this was the oddest kind of campaign, treating a son's trauma with the continuity of domestic care. Yet, the astonishment did not erase the effectiveness. Ethan's small returns were not linear. There were relapses and flat dies, yet the pattern of his advancing speech became measurable in human terms. A word here, a two-word phrase there. The house, built to host power, began to cradle a more fragile kind of authorial one, held by patience and ordinary attention. Not everyone welcomed the change. Victoria Sterling, the house manager, had been the pulse of the mansion for years. Her authority, like her manicure, was precise. She measured staff as inventory, and she saw threats in anything that pulled attention away from the order she believed in. Charlotte's humming, her casual kindness, and the way Maxwell's face smoothed in her presence were signals Victoria could not translate into anything but risk. In the formal language of her profession, Victoria's concerns sounded like maintenance, protocol deviations, inconsistent record-keeping, too much intimacy between staff and family. In the private language of a woman who had learned to protect a certain station, it sounded like danger. She watched the yellow gloves as if they were a flag raised on foreign soil. The gloves were, she decided, too familiar with the child. They belonged to a class of objects she mistrusted. Small things powerful in unpublicized ways. Seated jealousy is an uneventful thing at first. It attention to detail that grows into a thread. Victoria began to log incidents that had never seemed worth logging. Sand on the foyer carpet after Charlotte had taken Ethan to the garden. An unscheduled half-hour when Charlotte sat alone with him in the nursery. She tightened schedules around Charlotte's tasks, reassigning her so she had to move through a series of less visible rooms, hoping proximity would wither whatever intimacy had been growing. Charlotte took it with the stoicism of someone used to being overlooked. She continued to place a paper boat in the window, to fold small handkerchiefs, to hum herself through the hours. The house felt both warmer and more tense. The contrast was a taut wire in everyone's gut. There were people in Maxwell's orbit who bristled at his softening business associates who preferred him predictable. Enforcers who found tenderness impractical. They thought him distracted. Maxwell did not entertain their commentary. He was building something different, precarious and real. He made small changes in the household's routines. A new pediatric consultant here, an afternoon block for play there. The money continued to flow, but now alongside it ran something money had never purchased in his lifetime. The slow footwork of human repair. The first months held the small victories that reorganized lives. Ethan uttered mama in sleep once, a fragment Maxwell had never had the chance to cherish long enough to remember. He began to call out when someone left the room. He said card and laughed when the wheels rolled off a toy. These were not miraculous crescendos so much as incremental turns, like a tide that moves in inches until one day the shoreline has shifted and no one remembers when it began. Charlotte's kindness was not theatrical. She did not issue pronouncements about healing. Instead, she practiced a kind of stubborn normality. She brought a bowl of warm porridge when a storm knocked the power out for the cook's mother. She sat with Ethan when other staff were on coffee breaks. She left small notes in the laundry room. Found your pen, Mrs. Lang, in the same script she used to sign her mother's hospital forms. The household staff began to follow the rhythm without thinking about its origin. Habits can replicate themselves even in empires. Word of a miracle travels fast in some circles. It traveled slower in Maxwell's house because people there had learned the price of rumor. But what could not be suppressed was the simple fact that Maxwell Thornton, a man who had built himself on iron, felt his chest unclench when he listened to his son attempt a word. It was there that he began to change, not by shedding his past, but by adding tenderness to his arsenal. He rewarded Charlotte with a stable position, money for Dorothy's surgery, a small apartment in better light, and closer, and more importantly, unspoken protection. He asked her not to take the protective measures he might have imposed. Instead, he asked her to keep doing the things she did, best, showing up, humming, offering presents. The house exhaled a different air. The staff exchanged looks that were less clinical and more human. There was a shift in Maxwell himself. He began to linger at the edge of nursery doorways, watching Charlotte read and Ethan assemble his toy trains. He learned to stand without issuing commands and discovered the landscape of not knowing how to fix everything. He was learning to accept that sometimes being powerful meant stepping aside and letting tenderness do what machines could not. And yet, tenderness made enemies. Victoria's grievance became not simply about protocol, but about position. To her, Charlotte's care could not be just kindness. It had to be something else, to challenge her authority, to pull Maxwell's attention away, to alter the balance in the household. She began to stitch together a story that elevated her motives into reasons. Charlotte had been late for Lisbon's tea twice. She had left a single dust mote on porcelain. She had hugged the boy in ways Victoria found unnecessary. The notes Victoria made were precise, dry as paper, an artful record designed to look like routine when it was anything but. The first hint of actual sabotage came like a winter wind, unexpected and laced with cold. A Rolex belonging to Maxwell's late wife, Melissa, a watch he kept in a shadow box for days. He wanted to remind himself that some things still mattered, went missing. In the house of Maxwell Thornton, such a piece was more than jewelry. It held memory and measure. The watch was found under suspicious circumstances, tucked into the pocket of Charlotte's coat by someone who had watched her come in from the back staircase. There were witnesses, household staff, trained to notice ink when prompted, could tell a version of events that made sense to the vigilant. Victoria's note-taking glided into the hands of those who would present it as proof. The items were, as Victoria always preferred, situationally inconvenient. When confronted, Charlotte was bewildered. "I never touched it," she said, her voice actually carrying a rare tremor that betrayed the violence of being accused. She stammered, not because she was guilty, but because the machinery of accusation in that house moved too fast for protest. The Rolex gleamed in a palm-like evidence, and evidence in Maxwell's world cut quickly. The staff room turned into a courtroom, and no one in it had the patience for long pleas of innocence. Victoria's accusation was crisp and unemotional. "It was found in your coat pocket," she said. The way she said it carried the performance of certainty. Someone in the room nodded as if confirming a ledger entry. Another began to gather Charlotte's things. Charlotte felt the color drain from her as if being counted away. Ethan watched, the silent boy who had learned the sound of hummed lullabies in paper boats, and he went still in the way that made Maxwell's heart stop in a new way. They escorted Charlotte from the house in a rain that had started as a drizzle and become a steady, indecent downpour. The rain made sound against the stone entrance, a percussion that seemed to underline the finality of the moment. Charlotte's yellow gloves were in the pocket of her apron, invisible until the world peeled her defense away. She stepped into the night with Dorothy's surgery still unbooked in the paperwork of her life, and the storm took the edges off her silhouette. Someone shut the door behind her, as if it were an act of housekeeping and as if the house could be cleansed of the problem by exclusion. Ethan regressed in the vacuum of Charlotte's absence. The small gains became fragile as glass. He returned to the pause that had once been rhythm for him, a habit of silence like an old wound reopening. Maxwell sank into a posture he did not understand, stunned. He saw the security footage later, the thing every house had now, and watched the events unfold as if from outside himself, a man who thought in ledgers watching a ledger of a slide that he had not authorized. Victoria had presented the watch. She had produced a narrative. Staff had lined up to testify. Maxwell felt something inside him close into a box that he had thought he had opened. Charlotte, in the rain, did not fight. She had been raised to accept some kinds of blows without her knees going loose. She pulled her collar up and walked. She carried the yellow gloves tucked into the back pocket of her jeans like a secret amulet. Around her, the South Side continued its business on overdue lamp, a child calling for his mother in an empty lot, a bus that would not wait. She returned to Dorothy, who looked up at her as if nothing in the world could surprise her anymore. Dorothy's eyes, once luminous and full of complaint, were now small and worried, and Charlotte folded herself around the familiar work of care. Back at the mansion, a different kind of cold spread through the rooms. Maxwell moved through his house like a man who had discovered a loose stone in the foundation of something he believed indestructible. He had been the kind of man who dealt in certain outcomes. This was one he had not predicted because the variables were personal and messy. Victoria's certainty felt to him suddenly like a knife, precise, unnecessary. He watched the footage with a clarity that did not comfort him. He saw small hands, awkward angles, the quickness of someone who had planned. Then he saw the way Charlotte's shoulders slumped when the accusation was leveled. He had given her money, a home for Dorothy, a place in his life, and now a watch, something intimate and private, had been turned into a weapon. It is a peculiar kind of anger to be betrayed by procedure. There was a place inside Maxwell where blood answered to the notion of offense, and there was also a place where a father's instinct stood at attention. He felt both fury at the small, administrative cruelty of Victoria's machinations, and something else deeper, an ache for the boy who had lost words like pieces of a game. His first thought, like many men raised on other rules, was to correct the injustice in the language he knew best. Swift, decisive action. But the wound here was gentler, and it resisted his operative instincts. On the wet towel of that immediate aftermath, decisions congealed into plans. He could have fired Victoria that night. He could have made the house an island. But Maxwell was learning, awkwardly and not without loss, that power misused looks a lot like power. He paused because he lacked the proof he would need to exact punishment, and because he wanted to be sure that the thing he felt his misgiving was not merely the backlash of grief. He set about quietly. Internal review, a replaying of footage, private conversations with trusted aides. He kept his public face still for the servants, and called Charlotte's name twice in his head like one might try to remember a melody. Charlotte, on her side, sat with Dorothy in a one-room flat that now resembled a sanctuary and a cell. The yellow gloves sat on the windowsill, drying after she'd rinsed them clean that morning. In the droplets of water, they shone like small suns. She wrapped her hands around her mother's and tried to sort through grief that was not hers alone. The accusation burned at her like salt. She thought of Melissa in that box of memory Maxwell kept, how the watch had been part of a life. Maxwell remembered in certain light, felt the shame of someone accused of theft in a house that had given her so much. It was absurd that the thing that had helped heal a child might be the thing that would cost her a life of stability. Meanwhile, the boy who had finally learned to say all better sat in a nursery whose walls now seemed to echo the spaces he could not fill. Ethan dropped his stethoscope on the floor with a sound that was too loud in a room that had once been warm. He pressed his palms to his mouth like someone trying to hold a melody in place, and found it caught on the sharp edge of absence. The storm that night was not merely weather. It sounded like the house working at a new geometry, readjustments, drafts, and the click of doors shutting for reasons beyond the logic of a room. The rain drew hard lines down the glass as if the world itself were scoring the moment. Charlotte wrapped Dorothy tighter and burned the small candle there for both of them, while in a house of polished wood and silence. A clock ticked through a night that felt, to Maxwell, both too long and not long enough. Something in that sequence could not, be closed quietly. Accusation had a way of breaking a fragile trust into pieces that looked indistinguishable from truth. The yellow gloves, sitting on a sill between two lives, caught the light and watched the slow suture of two worlds begin to fray. If this kind of story surprises you, tap like it helps more people find it. Maxwell did not yet know that this was a turning point. He moved in the space between father and boss, calculating and not yet transformed in the only way that mattered. He ordered quiet investigations and watched footage that closed and opened like a secret. He felt the old machine of revenge waking in his bones, the industry of retribution he had cultivated for decades. But something else had been planted in him by the two words Ethan had given him: possibility. He started to look at his resources differently, not as instruments of fear, but as tools that might be wielded to repair rather than only to punish. Charlotte lived, after that storm, in the space of an accused woman who had the proof of her innocence doubted by those in power. She cleaned houses and begged hospital receptionists for appointment shifts. She stopped humming sometimes, and when she did, the silence draped itself over Dorothy's shoulders like a shawl. The yellow gloves traveled with her, a private covenant. They smelled faintly of lemon and the salt of rain, and Charlotte would press them into her pocket like a promise to herself. Victoria settled into her belief that she had preserved the house's dignity. She put her chin up and made appointments for new staff interviews, planting small seeds of replacement in the ledger of the household. She walked through the rooms as if clearing a stage, and felt justified in the tidy certainty of her actions. But certainty, like marble, is cold to the touch and brittle under pressure. The next few weeks held small cracks that widened in private. Staff members who had been near the laundry room the day the watch was found began to have second thoughts. One housekeeper, old enough to know how storms move through eaves, started muttering about a pocket unseen and about how the pocket might have a different story. Another, young and wary, saw the injustice plainly and began to leave little things: an unremarked pen placed in Charlotte's locker, a folded handkerchief with a note tucked inside that read, simply, "I saw nothing. I knew nothing." It was the kind of solidarity that shows up in small acts, quiet and fierce. Charlotte, for her part, kept doing the thing she had always done. She cared. She took an extra hour to sit with Ethan when the nights stretched long. She fixed Dorothy's soup and counted out pills, and hummed under her breath to keep the world from hollowing out. She kept the gloves clean and left them by the window to dry each night, their yellow color seeming to hold a kind of stubborn sunlight even when the day had been gray. So the house moved on the surface. Events, appointments, watchers without faces, and a man who now kept a photo of a child a little closer in his wallet. But the tension under the surface was a wire being tuned. Maxwell could feel it when he walked by the nursery and heard an absence like a held breath. He could feel it in the way his furniture no longer seemed to offer proper ceremony when something as raw as a child's voice was at stake. For Charlotte, the night the rain stopped and the rain of accusation quieted long enough for the absence to make itself felt, was a long, awkward thing. She lay awake and watched the glow of the street lamp through the curtains. She thought about the watch and its weight in gold, and about Melissa and her ghost in the house of Maxwell Thornton. She thought about the boy who had found his voice when she did something that cost nothing at all: hum a lullaby, fold a blanket, leave a toy with an invitation to play. She thought of the gloves drying on the sill and realized that small objects can carry the weight of decisions no one prepared you for. Downstairs, in a house of trained men with controlled faces, an old ledger was opened and questions were asked with the sort of politeness that carries an edge. Someone called Maxwell an hour after midnight with the phrase "irregularity in-house inventory," which sounded tidy and dangerous all at once. He listened, and he felt the old systems click into place. A prod here, a polite inquiry there. But now, something had shifted so that those systems felt unethical to him because they had been used to erase the person who healed his boy. He slept poorly that week, wandering the house at hours that did not belong to the living but to people who measured their days by control. The gloves on Charlotte's windowsill became, in his mind, a symbol he could not unpack. A simple thing worn by the hands of a woman who had not wanted his money and had not needed his pity. They had done what his money had failed to do: coax sound from a child's chest. When the flush of accusation cooled to a simmering uncertainty, Maxwell did the thing his grief allowed him to do. He plunged deeper. He asked around, with a gentleness he had not used in decades. He found a cleaner who said, in a voice that trembled when recalling the day the watch had been found, that it had seemed placed. He watched footage, on loop. Sometimes it looked like theft. Sometimes like a mistake. Sometimes like the choreography of someone trying to make a pile look like a crime. Victoria, watching the ebb and flow of Maxwell's attention, kept her posture. She made small, efficient notes and presented signatures of staff who corroborated the timeline that excused little glances of sympathy for Charlotte. She believed herself above corruption, for she had always believed order justified whatever means maintained it. Her hands were steady, her gaze was fixed. She had taken a risk and, in her view, preserved something vital. But she had also lit a fuse in a man who, despite himself, was beginning to understand that the measures he used against enemies were not the measures he wanted for people he loved. The house, that monument of quiet and control, had begun to breathe differently. In one of the nurseries, a small blue car rolled to a stop in the dust of a rug. In a flat down by the shop front, a woman whose hands bore the same shape as Charlotte's hummed the lullaby over her mother and wondered if she would ever sleep without the sound of accusation gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. And outside, the city went on with its disregard trucks, arguments, a child who tripped and rose. There are moments in which the world seems very small, and others, when it grows enormous. Maxwell walked the corridors feeling the scale of both. He had survived 1,000 attempts on his life, and had learned to expect the next one, like an accountant expecting another entry in a ledger. But this felt different. This was inside the ledger, the stuff of family and the soft metrics of care. He thought, wandering up the staircase he had never meant to climb so often, about the price of love, and the way it reorganized priorities. The house, with its expensive finishes and its silent corridors, had become the site of a domestic war he had not intended to fight. Charlotte, meanwhile, kept the yellow gloves clean. She rinsed them, and dried them, and tucked them into the edge of the sink like a relic. She hummed and stitched and taught Ethan how to make a paper boat with hands that had once been slapped down by teachers who mistook silence for indifference. She watched him build a track and moved one of the cars forward with a careful finger. And he giggled as if the sound had fallen through a sieve and landed whole in the room. And so, the night before the storm that would open into something far more violent than asphalt and rain, the house stood split between a man who could not buy his son's voice and a woman who had given it back with nothing more than attention. Between them stood a manager who had decided to rearrange lives to suit her sense of order, and a boy whose newly minted words trembled like fledglings testing the air. The pieces were aligning in ways no ledger could forecast. At the center was a pair of yellow rubber gloves drying quietly on a sill. They glowed like a small defiant sun, rumor of a miracle and relic of an accusation about to land. When Maxwell finally decided to act, it would not be in the currency he had used before. He would have to learn how to take a different kind of power into the world, one that protected without destroying, that punished only within the bounds of law, that understood the subtlety of saving a child without making the savior the author of new wounds. But he had not learned that yet. At the moment the accusation landed, he was still a man learning the grammar of tenderness. Charlotte's expulsion from the house in the rain closed certain doors and left others barely cracked. It pushed the child back into silence and shoved a man toward a decision he had been unequipped to make. The yellow gloves, folded and damp on the windowsill, watched the little drama and waited for hands to pick them up again. The next day would bring a discovery and a realization that would force Maxwell out of his chair and into the messy world beyond his leaded glass. It would be the kind of clarity that does not respect timetables, militant, sudden, and necessary. But that would not happen yet. For now, the house sat, its corridors echoing with the soft, dangerous sound of things not yet said, and a man and a woman held separate kinds of grief in the small rooms of their lives. He watched the footage 3 times before he believed it. The same frames looped on the grainy monitor, an ordinary corridor framed by ordinary luxury, and each time the image revealed another small thing that made the story change shape. A hand reached into a pocket. A watch flashed. A person stepped away with measured calm. At one silvered angle, the watch slipped from a shelving unit and into a coat as if gravity had found a secret path. At another, a face went slack the moment the accusation landed. Maxwell sat very still, the glow from the monitor casting a slow, deliberate light across his features. The mansion, with all its clean lines and disciplined rooms, felt suddenly porous. He had watched men plan assassinations and reroute fortunes. He had never seen a household staff meeting used as a staging ground for something this particular, this intimate, this small and poisonous. The footage did not look like a theft so much as an arrangement. The Relex's movement through space was too neat to be accidental. He reached for the desk drawer and found his hands again closing on old, private paper letters from the past. A photograph of Melissa, with her laugh half in shadow. It was as if the world had folded onto a single hinge and every decision lived on its other side. Maxwell thought of the boy in the nursery of the first syllable that had rung like a bell in a house that had never learned to sing. Realized that confidence without tenderness had nearly cost him the person he loved most. He called Victoria into his study. She arrived immaculate, a crisp silhouette against the soundless hush of the library, and she wore certainty like armor. Her voice was the practiced calm of someone who had always kept the ledger balanced. "You found something?" she asked, as if she were the one checking up on him. He placed the footage in front of her with a small, steady motion. She watched with the same composure, and for a breath she did not betray anything. "It corroborates testimony," she said finally. "Security corroborates." He had taught himself to be patient in business. Patience had not been kind to certainty. "It looks staged," he said. The word left him like a thrown cloth. She bristled, which surprised him. Staged. Maxwell. Charlotte was seen with it. Witnesses. Who moved the camera? He did not want to be the man who let impulse rule. He wanted the truth first. A micro-expression passed over Victoria's face, a flicker Maxwell had learned to read in the men who lied to him. It was almost imperceptible, like a shadow crossing marble. She closed the file with a practiced hand and said, "We followed procedure." He looked at her for a long moment. There was a quality in her certainty that had the right architecture of conviction, but not the warmth he now found necessary. He had the resources to make certainty permanent, pay people to swear. Erase options, but the memory of Ethan's first words made him wary of doing damage in the currency of force. "I want the raw feeds," he said. "No edits. No summaries. Everything." Victoria's mouth tightened. Very well. He felt something else then. A small, steady thread of motion in the chest he hadn't expected. Impatience mixed with dread. He left the study with Raymond at his shoulder. Raymond Collins, a man whose face had been part of Maxwell's story longer than some. Currency, and he moved through the household with the precise, legal patience of a man who had learned when to deploy violence and when to deploy evidence. The raw feeds told the rest of the story, framed by unvarnished frame. They revealed the gloved hand and unknown housekeeper's hand sliding the watch like a slip of gold into Charlotte's coat. But the hand that had slipped it there did not belong to the person who had thought to look guilty. Camera angles that had briefly been turned away caught a second person in the corridor than Victoria herself, in conversation with a standby who had the kind of face that belonged in places where paperwork and advantage met. It was not conclusive in a legal sense, but the frame offered a logic that was impossible to ignore. Someone had built an accusation. The realization landed with the sound of something breaking. Maxwell left the files open and walked to the nursery window, where the boys' toys lay like a city, paused. He thought of the way Charlotte's hands folded small blankets, and the way those same hands had coaxed a syllable back into the world. He thought of the gloves that had once been small suns on her windowsill. He went out looking for her. The city received him differently than the staff did. The South Side had its own rhythms, cheaper light, louder rain when it came, closer walls between neighbors. Maxwell's car drew attention not because it was loud but because it belonged to another sort of weather. He walked to the flat where Charlotte and Dorothy lived as if learning how to enter a new language. Raymond close behind. He knocked and waited, and the door opened to a life reduced to the essentials. A bed, a kitchen table, a stack of hospital forms. Charlotte saw him with guarded curiosity. When she realized who stood on the threshold, she did not make an immediate movement to step back. This was a woman who had learned the measure of fear and did not indulge it. Dorothy sat, propped against pillows, pale but lucid, the tired wire of illness in her eyes. "I should not have allowed this to happen," Maxwell began, but the words were too formal, too far from the thing he needed to say. Charlotte's voice, when she answered, was level. "You didn't see it," she said. "You were elsewhere." He met her eyes. "I should have known," he said instead. The confession felt like a small, practical wound. "I should have listened sooner." She watched him for another beat. There was a history between them now that had the texture of something hard and renewable. She had been given money and offer that changed the geometry of her life on, then stripped by an accusation. She knew the language of power. "You found the feeds," she said. "I did." He almost told her in that moment everything about Victoria, about the watch, about the way the footage told a story that had been crafted to hurt her. But he did not want his words to sound like absolution, but at a clerical cost. He reached instead for something he had not offered casually before, an apology that carried his weight. "I was wrong." She held the yellow gloves in her hand then, as if perhaps to test whether the world would allow them to remain in her life. The sight of them made something rush up in him like light. "Those gloves?" he said, voice tendering without a plan. He stopped. There had been a moment, watching Ethan, when he had seen the gloves as talisman. Now they were talisman and argument both. Charlotte's expression changed, small and complicated. "You don't have to." "What I have to do," Maxwell said, "is fix what this house did to you." She searched him, and the search was not entirely on the surface. The man who stood there had been a creator of consequences, a constructor of systems that had decided who lived and who did not. But she saw something else now. A person trying to be different with the bluntness of someone who had never practiced vulnerability. He had bled metaphorically over the boy's silence. Now he bled in a way he had not before into the simple, awful grief of being wrong. She agreed to let him help Dorothy, not because money wrote a check he had not already written, but because she saw, in the lines of his face, a sort of focus she had not expected. He flew them to a hospital with a private wing. Surgeons and specialists became a procedural background. Charlotte stood in the corridor as doctors came and went, and she watched Maxwell sit in the small mechanical chairs outside the operating theaters, with his hands clasped and his eyes on nothing. There was a rawness in him she had not known how to name. She found herself, unexpectedly, watching for signs he was human. After Dorothy's operation and the film of days that followed when her color returned, and the nausea subsided, there was a quiet repair to do. Maxwell came to the flat more than once. He did not simply sign another check. He brought groceries sometimes, and he sat on the edge of the small kitchen table and learned about pills and appointments and the insistent schedules that dictated Dorothy's small victories. He learned where the coupons were kept and how Charlotte made the soup that soothed Dorothy's stomach. One evening, when rain tapped like fingernails on the window, and the world smelled of wet cement, he took his coat off and revealed beneath his sleeve the red stain of a wound, a long, thin abrasion that had bled where men had tried to slow him down. He had been ambushed on the road, he said without bravado. The men had been hired to intimidate, not to slay. He had not wanted to tell the detailed slew of names, methods of approach, because those felt like the old weapons. He told her instead the fact of it, that he had come to look for her and they had tried to stop him. She took him in, and with the same pragmatism she offered to tend the cut. He let her. She worked with a clean cloth and warm water. The yellow gloves lay in the sink like a sunny question. He watched her with an attention that felt like a confession. She cleaned the wound with deliberate, patient strokes, and it was oddly intimate as life in her hands, hers in the use of steady motions learned in years of care. The gloves protected her, and in the odd, domestic light of the kitchen, Maxwell felt his walls soften. "You could have come sooner," she said finally, not as accusation so much as fact. "I should have," he repeated. He had said that before. Now the words held more than regret. "I should have known to protect you, not punish you." Charlotte sighed, a small sound that was almost a laugh. "You protect with men. I don't mind you protecting me. I mind when you forget there are people underneath." She paused. You're different when you watch Ethan. He looked at her then like a man seeing a map suddenly revealed. I don't want to be the man who teaches him to solve everything with fear. You can learn, she said. There is a slow gravity to learning when someone has built their life on a different gravity. Maxwell stumbled into change with the fumbling steadiness of someone practicing new muscles. He confronted Victoria with the frames he had catalogued and the testimonies that had quietly shifted in favor of the truth. Victoria did not fall apart. She had built herself on composure, but the Board of Household Administrators is not an unmoving thing. And there are moments when even confident stacks of paper must be Victoria was dismissed from her post with formal civility and private indignation. Her departure was not spectacular. There was no shouting, only the clinical arrangement of boxers in the foyer and the rattle of her heels down the marble steps. Maxwell had the option to ruin her reputation publicly, but he chose to sever ties with the quiet brutality of a man who wanted to stop the rot without adding rot of his own. She left with the posture of someone wronged, and in the private corners of the mansion men who had been loyal to her wondered if their loyalties had been miscalculated. Maxwell paid out a severance that was both generous and cold. He wanted the episode closed without the corrosive pleasure of vengeance. Charlotte returned to work. The yellow gloves reappeared in the back pocket of her apron, as if they had never left. She resumed the small routines that formed her theology. Fold, hum, place a toy where it invited touch. The boy's speech regained its fragile momentum. Maxwell learned the art of humility in small measures. He lingered outside the nursery, sometimes catching himself at the threshold, sometimes crossing it and sitting on the floor to listen to Charlotte read aloud. He learned to accept advice, to ask questions instead of issuing decrees. In that unglamorous space, he found the life he had not known he wanted. It might have been enough, but the world outside the house was not a place that politely yielded to domestic peace. Antoni Ricci had been a knotted shadow in Maxwell's life for years. He had been an adversary whose reach and temper were calibrated to fear. When Melissa's death had been arranged, the blame had been a buried thing with a face. Ricci had eyes on cruelty and used leverage like currency. He would not accept Maxwell's turn toward tenderness without feeling a burn of grievance. If the house had taught him anything, it was that even small victories invite. The night Ricci made his move, the city smelled of ozone and a storm that had not decided whether to fall. Charlotte had taken Ethan to a relative's for a short while. Dorothy was stable, and they thought movement outside might do the boy good. She had misread where safety lay. The abduction happened quick and correct. Men moved like knives on the dark canvas of a neighborhood that forgot it was observed. There was no cinematic struggle. There was the compressing reality of being taken fast enough to prevent screaming and slow enough to ensure compliance. The child's small hands were bundled into the crook of Charlotte's arm as if her body could be a shield, made of the stubborn stuff of human courage. She pressed Ethan to her chest and felt his breath like a small, tremulous animal. He smelled of lemon cleaner and paper and the faint residue of hospital antiseptic. In the white noise of the van she held him and whispered humming songs until his breathing slowed. Richie's men were precise. They were not cruel for the sake of cruelty. They had an agenda. They wanted leverage, a message in muscle and fear. When Charlotte saw the face that marked their calculation, Ricci himself, she did not see at first. His presence required an easy hubris. She felt the old muscle tighten in her that had been honed by a childhood that required survival skills, not romance. The call that reached Maxwell was a human thing, a voice, cracked and urgent, speaking only a number in a tone Maxwell knew as the kind used by men who reconcile desperate math. He felt an animal response like a line being pulled taut. He gathered Raymond and a small coalition people who could find names and open doors, and he moved without the clumsy armor of bureaucracy. He moved with the urgency of a man who had already learned what was possible to lose. The rescue was not a single cinematic burst. It was a work of angles and risk and people who owed him their lives in ways that felt different in moments like this. Maxwell found the place because someone owed him a favor, because small details clicked into place: an overheard meeting, a license plate's timing, a courier who knew where the vans passed. But the details are not a manual. They are fragments that must be handled with care. The compound where they were held had eyes. Then it had none. Men burst through doors. Voices turned from the mechanical to the human. And, in the chaos, Maxwell found himself face to face with the child who had been his whole life, and the woman who had become something like it. Charlotte had wrapped herself around Ethan like a coat in winter. He was tiny and fierce, an animal that trusted her implicitly. He did not look like a possession, he looked like a life. Ryochi stood nearby, a man who had less imagination than ambition, and for a second, Maxwell saw in him the cheapest of motivations, power as ownership. Maxwell's fists closed and his breath measured itself against the old script. Avenge had always been currency in his world. Men, like balances, had been disposed of before Maxwell learned to speak tenderness. Raymond's hand was steady at his sleeve. "We can end him," Raymond said, voice soft as a ledger. The suggestion was not a proposal, it was a statement of what the old life would have done. Maxwell looked at Ryochi for a long moment. The man had a face that suited his deeds, greased, small-limbed in the way of a person who believed the world owed him. Maxwell felt the familiar heat rise, the part of him that had been forged in the cold metal of the underworld. He imagined 1,000 ways to close the ledger, but the thought of Ethan, the child who had been coaxed back into speech by something as simple as presence, held him like a new moral gravity. He had watched the boy learn words that had not come because someone punched harder or spent more. He had learned that tenderness could be deployed as power too. "No," he said. The single syllable was less a refusal than a decision. It sounded like the man he wanted to be, not the man he had been. He stepped forward and, in front of everyone, he placed his hand on Richie's shoulder and then removed it. It was a show of authority that did not have to be violent. He called the authorities lawful people who could ensure the man was removed and kept removed. He placed him under arrest in the way he had always known how to plan operations, but this time the operation's end was legal, not fatal. The room hummed with the aftershock of someone choosing the law over blood. Ryochi looked at Maxwell with a mixture of fury and something like respect. He was carted away in cuffs, and later he would sit in a cell and scratch at the walls of a life he had imagined would never be contained. The court took its slow, unromantic steps. Evidence was gathered. Testimonies were offered. The system, in gravest and least glamorous of ways, did its work. The judge handed out a life sentence. Maxwell sat through the proceedings and felt strangely a certain exhaustion in the victory. It was a victory that had cost them fear and near loss, but not blood. In the weeks that followed, the masonry of their lives shifted again, but toward a gentler architecture. Dorothy recovered steadily. The hospital released her, and the small flat expanded into a place that could breathe a little. Maxwell provided a full-time caregiver, but the greatest gift was the return of a life without constant edge of fear. He paid for home renovations that made the flat warmer and safer. He took the yellow gloves and, with Charlotte's hesitant permission, had them cleaned and framed in a small glass case that sat on the nursery dresser by Ethan's bed. The gloves, once simple utility, were now relic, a symbol of the ordinary thing that had reshaped a household. Charlotte and Maxwell moved slowly toward what people with less complicated pasts called a relationship. There was no sudden romance like in novels. There were small, domestic gestures. Maxwell learning how to buy the soup she liked instead of ordering catered food. Charlotte teaching him how to fold towels so that they look like paper swans. Maxwell showing up at the clinic and waiting for hours simply to be with Dorothy as she had tests. He learned humility in the way you learn a new language, by listening. She learned trust in the increments of shared time. Love, in their context, was less a wildfire than a patient lamp. It burned steady and level. They kissed once, in the nursery doorway, while Ethan slept with his thumb in his mouth, and a fleet of toy cars paused along the threshold. Maxwell's hands shook a little, a relic of years holding other things too tightly. Charlotte's fingers were steady. Their union was not a solution. It was a choosing. On Ethan's next birthday, the house filled with a softness it had not known in years. The staff, those who had remained and those who had returned under new terms, brought small gifts. Dorothy laughed with a sound that made the rooms lighter. Maxwell organized a party that was intentionally small. He understood now that excess sometimes smothers what it tries to honor. He stood in the corner and watched Charlotte place a paper hat on Ethan's head. He watched the two of them together and felt something rearrange inside that was not sadness or power but belonging. And then, in a voice that made the room hush with a tenderness that felt like revelation, Ethan looked up at Charlotte, the woman who had hummed him into speech and who had slept in corridor chairs and who had protected him with a courage that did not need parade. And he said, without rehearsal and with startling simplicity, "Mom." The word arrived like a settling. Maxwell felt the house itself exhale. Charlotte's hands went to her mouth and then to the child. He had said it before, all better, but this was different. The syllable folded two lives together in a way both practical and holy. No legal document bound them in that moment. Nothing could be more binding than the sound of a child naming the place he had been given to belong. They married months later in a small ceremony at the edge of the estate's walled garden. It was private, not ostentatious, a legal affirmation and a promise. Maxwell wore a jacket that sat comfortably on him because the man had learned how to be a different kind of authority. Charlotte wore a simple dress she had chosen because it let her move freely. Dorothy sat between them at the front, a smile creasing her face. Ethan was a small ambassador of joy, wearing a paper crown again, firm in a world that had once been too strange. Victoria's fate was less theatrical. She moved out of the professional sphere that had suited her and retreated into a life of consulting for estates, where the stakes were lower and the formulas clearer. She kept the dignity of someone who had been forced to accept consequences. She was not ruined, but she had lost the particular currency of the mansion she had stewarded. Maxwell did not celebrate her downfall. He accepted it as a correction and as a relief. Riachi, meanwhile, sat in a cell where the walls had no atmosphere. The courts gave him a sentence that matched the weight of his actions. There was no catharsis in his end, for Maxwell only, a practical sense that justice, however imperfect, had functioned. There was also the knowledge that choices had consequences beyond the ledger. He had chosen tenderness and, in doing so, had refused the old instinct for a permanent solution in blood. Years later, the gloves remained in their frame, a bright slice of yellow, preserved under glass. Ethan ran his fingers over the glass sometimes and watched the color catch the light. He would, being the child he was, rearrange the toys and insist on taking turns driving a toy car up Maxwell's palm. He learned new words like tools, and also words like apologies and patience. Maxwell and Charlotte built a life that was neither naive nor small. They were people who had been formed by danger and healed by care. There were nights when Maxwell still walked the corridors of his house and listened for echoes. He would pause in the doorway to the room where a small car sat on a shelf and think about the particular alchemy that had made speech return. He would remember the yellow gloves on the sill and the woman who had worn them, and he would feel like a man who had learned a new trade. The muscle of restraint relax. The final image that settled itself in Maxwell's mind was not of power or of money. It was small and domestic. A pair of yellow gloves, framed and sitting on a dresser by a child's bed, catching the morning light. The gloves had once been a tool. They had become a resume of sorts, a record that tenderness, given and practiced, could do what fury and currency could not. He wrote one line in the margins of his life after that. Riches could buy anything, but they could not buy repair. Repair came from hands that showed up, from someone who hummed in the half-light and placed paper boats on a sill. It came from the small economies of care. If this moved you, subscribe for more true-feeling stories and share it with someone who needs hope today. In the end, Maxwell kept the house open in a different way. He welcomed neighbors to the table for holiday suppers. He funded scholarships in the South Side for children who needed safe places to learn. He taught Ethan not just how to run a business, but how to sit with another person's fear until it seemed a little less enormous. Charlotte taught him how to fold a perfect napkin, and he taught her how to steer a meeting. Together they found a vocabulary neither had known was missing. Ethan, who had once been a silence Maxwell could not buy away, grew into an insistently ordinary boy who wanted to build tracks, and sometimes to argue about which toy was fast. One afternoon, years after the night that had started everything, he found a pair of used yellow gloves in the drawer where the family kept odd things. He wrapped them over his small hands and declared himself the keeper of sunshine. Charlotte laughed and kissed his forehead. Maxwell, watching, felt again the small rearrangement of everything that mattered. He had once believed that wealth was the answer to every problem. The house had taught him that there were things money could do, and things it could not. The night that closed the story had no grand cinematic flourish. It had instead the soft light of a house where a child learned to name what he loved, where a woman who had known only survival learned to belong, and where a man who had built an empire learned that the richest thing he could offer his child was the space to speak. The yellow gloves, bright and unapologetic in their color, remained a daily testament. Sometimes the smallest hands do the most radical work.